We don't exactly know what it was used for, but some think that the Mississippians may have conducted ritual human sacrifices, like the Mesoamerican civilizations to the south. That's because the remains indicate it was mostly young women buried in these mass graves. Some were likely strangled if they were indeed killed for this purpose, but others could have died of bloodletting. 4 men were found with their heads and hands cut off, and another burial pit had mostly males who'd been clubbed to death. The reason we think that it is due to a ritual ceremony and not due to warfare that these people died, or maybe an execution of enemies, is that researchers haven't found evidence of warfare or invasion from outsiders. So the people of Cahokia themselves might have received this violence and doled it out. Emerson said he excavated other Native American sites that were filled with arrowheads left behind by war. But at Cahokia, there were almost none. So it seems that the danger was from people on top of society, not from people from other tribes or locations attacking them. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Cahokia was abandoned by the time European explorers encountered it. So the question of what happened to it is still ongoing, but it's been a source of a lot of debate for centuries. When archaeology became a formal discipline in the 19th century, early archaeologists who were working on this question attributed the building of these mounds to just about anybody except American Indians. They thought it could be Hindus, Welshmen, Vikings. Somebody visiting from another continent and building these and then leaving seemed more plausible to them at the time. John Fitch, who built America's first steam-powered boat in 1785, thought that earthworks like these found in Ohio, called the Newark earthworks, were used for military-style fortifications. This contributed to the idea that before Native American civilization was there were highly skilled warriors of unknown origin that populated the North American continent. They were a lost civilization that left behind huge works, some sort of ancient Egypt in the New World, or a Mesopotamian-style civilization. These mounds were thought of the ruins of a distant past, or even natural manifestations of the landscape. The American naturalist William Bartram, who lived in the 1700s and early 1800s, recorded local Native American narratives of the mounds, and they seem to match these mythical origins of the mounds, according to the legends of the people there. In his early journals, which were published in 1791, he recorded that the Creek and the Cherokee who lived around the mounds attributed their construction to the ancients, many ages prior to their arrival and possessing of this country. Bartram's account of the Creek and Cherokee histories led to the view that these Native Americans were colonizers, much in the way that Europeans and later Americans were colonizers of this land. And in the 1830s and 1840s, in the age of manifest destiny, this was a way to serve for the justification of the removal of Native Americans for their ancestral lands. Because if Native Americans themselves were colonizers and had removed people, then why couldn't white Americans do the same thing? Later on in the 19th century, with the discovery of ruins in the New World with Mesoamerican civilizations, an increasing number of researchers believed that New World civilizations could reach achievements in Eurasia. With the discovery of massive stone cities in Central America and Mexico, some thought that New World societies could be compared culturally and technologically to those in Europe. However, what really shifted people's thinking was a book published by Lewis Henry Morgan in 1881 called Houses and House Life of the American Aborigines. Morgan was an anthropologist and social theorist, and he thought that Mesoamerican societies, like the Maya and the Aztec, reached the evolutionary category of what he called middle barbarism, which was the highest stage of cultural and technological evolution that any indigenous group in the Americas achieved. In contrast, he said that the Native Americans in the territories of the new United States were examples of Stone Age cultures or Neolithic pre-agricultural cultures that were static, they didn't progress, and were absolutely incapable of technological or cultural adjustment. This view shaped the archaeological research of the time and lasted for decades. At the same time, there was a kinder view of American Indian civilization, but it was equally condescending. This was the idea of the Vanishing Indian, history of a view in the 18th and 19th centuries that depicted Native Americans as a vanishing race that couldn't adapt to American civilization. This was a sentimental view held by people like Thomas Jefferson, who he himself excavated a Native American burial mound. And he was sad about the disappearance of what he called the noble Indians due to violence and corruption of white civilization and the ultimate inferiority of their civilization. So their customs and beliefs had to be documented for posterity. But to their credit at the time, some of the early Americans viewed Indians as models that the new republic could use in the creation of its own national identity and legacy. Well, in the last century, archaeological research has changed our understanding of the mound builders. They're not seen as isolated monuments created by a race that disappeared. Today, some tribes link their own history to the mound builders. The Mississippi Band of the Choctaw view the mounds as places that tie their communities to their ancestral lands. So, based on what archaeologists agree on as much as they can, who were the people that made up the Mississippian culture? Now, sadly, there is a lot we don't know. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't really know anything beyond what their material remains they left behind can tell us. We don't have any oral histories from surviving tribes because those weren't passed down. All we can really do is look at the archaeological remains and try to piece it back together. So, Mississippian culture, which is the last major prehistoric cultural development in North America, spreads over a huge area of the Southeast and the mid-continent, including the river valleys in the states of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And there are some extensions in Wisconsin and Minnesota. When you're connected by river networks, you can go a long way. We already talked about all the crops that this civilization was based on, and they made it possible for a number of towns and villages to pop up. Each of these would dominate a satellite of lesser villages, and government was likely in the hands of priest rulers. So these village states were theocratic in nature. There wasn't a unitary government that controlled all of these different areas. It was more like confederacies, and in times of warfare, alliances between these settlements were constantly shifting. The nucleus in a Mississippian town was a central ceremonial plaza. Each settlement had one or more pyramidal or oval earth mounds that would be surmounted by a temple or chief's residence grouped around the plaza. This settlement was similar to those found in Central and South Mexico and Guatemala. It didn't diffuse into North America until the advent of Mississippian culture. So there could have been some connection between those civilizations. In fact, there likely was, but we don't know how deep it was. Because of the large infrastructure projects like Monk's Mound in Cahokia, it suggests that there was a dominant religious cult and priest rulers that were at least strong enough to command the services of a large, docile population, along with several artists and craftsmen. So there's a number of things that makes a settlement Mississippian in culture, and what this includes is a construction of one of these earthwork pyramids, agriculture based on maize, shell-tempered pottery. This means that marine shells are used as tempering agents in ceramics, widespread trade networks that went as far west as the Rocky Mountains, as far north as the Great Lakes, as far south as the Gulf of Mexico, and as far east as the Atlantic. There was also the development of the chiefdom or complex chiefdom level of social complexity. There was institutionalized social inequality. There was a centralization of political and religious power in the hands of few, or maybe even one. The beginnings of a settlement hierarchy in which one major center with mounds had influence over a number of lesser communities that may or may not have had a smaller number of mounds. And finally, a common set of rituals. And we mentioned earlier that game, Chunky, which was a ritual game playing. The Mississippians had no stone architecture. They worked with naturally occurring metal deposits, and they would do things like hammer copper for ritual objects and make copper plates and other decorations, but they didn't smelt iron or practice bronze metallurgy. So that's an overview of Mississippian culture. What happened to Cahokia? That's our question we're going to look at now. One of the biggest problems it had, and other large centers like it also had, was keeping a steady supply of food. Another problem was waste disposal for dense populations. You'll constantly have outbreaks of disease if you don't have proper sanitation, and even if you do, it's really not until the 20th century when urban centers are able to effectively get rid of waste and not have terrible outbreaks constantly happen. Cahokia became unhealthy for other reasons, including polluted waterways, and Because it was an unhealthy place to live, it had to fight with population decline. Dean Snow, in his book Archaeology of Native North Americas, argues that the town had to rely on social and political attractions to bring in a steady supply of new immigrants. Otherwise, the town's death rate would have been higher than the birth rate and eventually would have been abandoned earlier. Well, despite these efforts, the population of Cahokia began to decline in the 13th century, and eventually the city was abandoned in 1300. The area around it wasn't reoccupied by indigenous tribes until around 1350. There's other theories of why the city was abandoned. In addition to pollution problems, there could have been deforestation, overhunting, and flooding. The city was built on a floodplain, so in that sense, it's not ideal. It is easy to get to, so as a site of major religious pilgrimage, it's a great location. But as the easiest place to build a settlement, it's not the best location. Cahokia could have also been invaded by outsiders, but like we said earlier, there's not a lot of archaeological evidence of warfare. There's the defensive wood stockade and watchtowers that enclose Cahokia's main ceremonial precinct, but there's no other evidence of warfare. So the palisade may have been used for ritual instead of military purposes, and it makes sense to have a ritual building in a religious pilgrimage site. Disease in the urban population could have also caused a decline. There could have been a plague outbreak or any other type of outbreak that could have caused it to be hit so hard that it couldn't recover. Or it's likely a number of these factors put together. In 2015, researchers found evidence of major floods at Cahokia. It was severe enough to flood dwelling places, so people could have left, it could have caused an outbreak, and causing a downward spiral. The first European explorer to come across Cahokia was the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, and he reached it in 1540. By then, the city had been vacant for centuries. French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet missed the mounds in 1673 in their expedition, and they didn't report finding any Indians in the area. French monks found Cahokia's mounds in the mid-1700s and later named the largest one after themselves. The nearby Illinois Indians in the region told Europeans that they didn't know who had built the mounds. In fact, the name Cahokia is a misnomer because the people there didn't call themselves that. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what language they spoke or what songs they sang. The name Cahokia comes from the name of a subtribe of the Illinois that didn't reach the area until the 1600s and came from the east. Perhaps the downfall could have been caused from social reasons instead of environmental reasons. There was growing class stratification in Cahokia. The rulers lived in mounds and wooden houses and looked down on others, literally. William Mismanagement, an archaeologist, compared the Cahokians to Mesoamerican civilizations in the south in that their social systems became entrenched. Power and position were arguably passed by birthright, and you had a caste system that was similar to arrangements seen in other Native American groups along the Mississippi. Indians in Mexico had a similar social system, but we don't know what direct connections were found between them and the Mississippians. Another reason for their collapse could be environmental mismanagement. As the population of Cahokia grew, the ratio of people to arable land also rose. The area was prone to flooding, and it only got worse due to all the tree cutting along nearby bluffs, causing soil erosion, making the cropland too marshy for corn. So you had to bring in crops from further afield and increase trade. Plus, at this time in the 13th century, there was the Little Ice Age, where globally there was a cooling period, which could have hurt the growing season. With deforestation, it took longer walks for firewood. Cahokians used oak and hickory in the early years, but then later switched it up to energy-poor, softer woods, a sign of problems. You'd have to cut down a lot of wood to heat buildings, but also build those palisades. So with all that tree cutting, it could destroy wildlife habitats. But that might have been done to overhunting, because how many deer could survive if you're close to a town of 15,000 people, armed with bows and arrows who can easily pick off deer from far away? There's not evidence of a sanitary system, definitely not a sewer in Cahokia, so dysentery and tuberculosis could have reached epidemic proportions. Or another theory is maybe the people there didn't die off. Maybe they were simply tired of city life. It's not as if people would be urbanized and, I don't know, for a lack of better term, city slickers in the way we think of today, where they're not able to handle nomadic life, but many might have just decided to up and leave and return to a hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle. Archaeological excavations of Neolithic settlements find that the people who live in towns and subsist on agriculture frequently traded with